Hey guys, tonight we're heading into some of the most secure facilities on Earth to understand how criminal organizations kept running, kept growing, and in some cases kept getting richer, while their leadership sat in a cell with no phone and officially no way to reach the outside world at all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always nice to see who's drifting off with us tonight from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture the most secure job termination imaginable. You're arrested, convicted, sentenced, and moved into a facility specifically designed to cut you off from the outside world. No internet, no phone on your desk, no assistant fielding your calls. By every reasonable definition, your career should be finished the moment the cell door closes behind you. And yet, across an enormous swath of criminal history, this has turned out to be one of the least reliable assumptions anyone in law enforcement has ever made. Bosses have continued issuing orders from inside maximum security prisons. Cartels have kept moving product with a founder locked in a cell hundreds of miles from the nearest shipment. Entire criminal codes, entire hierarchies, entire recruitment pipelines have been built, refined, and enforced by men who were, on paper, completely removed from the world they continued to run. It's a bit like discovering your former manager somehow kept approving your expense reports for another 18 months after being let go from the company, except in this case nobody in HR ever quite figured out how, and the consequences of asking too many questions tended to be considerably worse than an awkward email thread. The honest answer to how this kept happening isn't a single dramatic secret. It's a long list of small, unglamorous workarounds, repeated patiently across different countries and different decades, exploiting the same basic gap every single time. A prison can control a body far more easily than it can control a message. And once you understand that gap, the entire history of criminal organizations operating from behind bars starts to look less like a mystery and considerably more like an inevitability. It's worth understanding just how the tattoo system managed to remain a reliable credential for so many decades despite operating with absolutely no central registry, no verification database, and no formal authority policing its use beyond the informal judgment of other prisoners themselves. The system functioned, essentially, through distributed peer review, conducted continuously across an enormous, geographically scattered population that nonetheless shared a remarkably consistent understanding of what each specific symbol was supposed to mean, and who had genuinely earned the right to wear it. This distributed verification worked because the penalty for wearing an unearned symbol was severe enough, and enforced consistently enough across the entire system, that the deterrent effect alone kept most forgery attempts from ever being seriously attempted in the first place. A prisoner discovered wearing stars he hadn't earned faced consequences that could include forced removal of the tattoo itself, through methods considerably more painful than the original application, alongside a complete and often permanent loss of standing within the wider criminal community. Compare this to how modern credential fraud tends to get treated in most professional contexts, where a fabricated resume claim might result in termination, or perhaps mild professional embarrassment if discovered publicly, but rarely anything approaching the kind of severe, physically enforced consequence that kept the Vori tattoo system remarkably honest for generations. It's also worth noting how the specific visual language itself evolved over time, developing regional variations and increasingly specific symbols as the network grew larger and more complex, while still maintaining enough underlying consistency that a prisoner transferred across the entire breadth of the Soviet prison system could generally still be read correctly by strangers who had never met him and had no other way of verifying his claimed history. This is a genuinely impressive feat of decentralized standardization, achieved entirely without any of the formal institutional mechanisms modern organizations typically rely on to maintain consistent standards across a large, dispersed population. And it worked, by most accounts, remarkably well for the better part of a century. It's worth adding one more dimension to the Vori story before moving on, because the network's durability didn't stop at the boundary of the Soviet Union itself. As Soviet immigration policy loosened in later decades, and especially after the Soviet collapse, members of this culture carried their entire value system, and in many cases their actual criminal connections, into new countries entirely, contributing to organized crime networks that emerged across parts of the former Eastern Bloc and eventually into Western Europe and North America. A code developed inside remote labor camps, refined over generations under conditions almost nobody outside those camps ever directly witnessed, proved portable enough to survive not just a transfer between prisons, but a transfer between entire nations and entire legal systems. This portability across such an enormous geographic and cultural distance is genuinely remarkable when you consider how localized and specific the original conditions producing this culture actually were. It's a bit like discovering that a very particular corporate culture, developed inside one unusually isolated regional office, somehow ended up shaping how an entire multinational company operates decades later and continents away, simply because enough of the original employees carried those specific habits and specific expectations with them wherever they eventually relocated. The Vori Code proved to be exactly that: durable, outlasting the very state that had unintentionally created the conditions for its formation in the first place. This same basic tension, physical containment against informational containment, shows up again and again in the stories ahead. Some organizations solved it through low-tech patience, some through exploiting legal protections never designed with criminal coordination in mind, some through outright corruption of the very staff meant to prevent it. But underneath every specific method lies the same underlying observation. A wall stops a body extremely well and stops a message rather poorly, and centuries of prison design have never fully closed that particular gap, no matter how determined the institution attempting it happened to be. It's worth understanding why this gap between physical control and informational control turned out to be so much harder to close than anyone initially expected, because the intuitive assumption going into the modern era of prison design was that better walls, better locks, and better surveillance would eventually solve the problem completely. Prison architecture across the 20th century became genuinely sophisticated, from the radial designs pioneered in the 19th century to the highly controlled, sensor-laden facilities built in more recent decades. Every one of these architectural advances made physical escape harder. None of them on their own made communication meaningfully harder, because communication doesn't require the body to move at all. It only requires information to move, and information, it turns out, is considerably harder to physically contain than a human being. This is worth comparing to how modern corporate security thinks about data breaches versus physical break-ins. A company can install the most sophisticated physical security imaginable around its headquarters, biometric locks, armed guards, reinforced doors, and still lose everything overnight to someone who simply extracts information remotely, without ever setting foot on the property at all. The lesson prison systems learned slowly, over decades of frustrating experience, is a lesson corporate security teams eventually learned too. Containing a body and containing information are simply different problems, requiring entirely different tools, and confusing the two leads to exactly the kind of false confidence that let so many of the organizations in tonight's story keep operating for so long. There's a deeper irony buried in all of this worth sitting with before we move forward into the specific stories that make up the rest of tonight's journey. The very features that make a prison humane, allowing family visits, permitting legal counsel, providing access to exercise yards and shared meals, are precisely the features that create the communication gaps these organizations have exploited for generations. A prison genuinely designed to eliminate every single communication channel would need to eliminate nearly everything that makes incarceration survivable as a human experience. No modern legal system has ever been willing to go that far, and the organizations examined tonight have built entire operating models around exactly that unwillingness. In the Soviet Union's vast network of labor camps, a strange and durable criminal culture took root among career convicts known as the Vori Zakon, roughly translated as thieves-in-law. These weren't simply hardened inmates keeping their heads down until release. They were building, inside some of the most brutal prison conditions the 20th century ever produced, an entire alternative society with its own laws, its own leadership, and its own strict code of conduct that had almost nothing to do with the Soviet state officially holding them captive. The code itself was remarkably specific. A true Vor was forbidden from cooperating with authorities in any capacity, forbidden from holding a legitimate job, forbidden even from maintaining a conventional family life that might create loyalties competing with the brotherhood itself. In exchange for this near-total renunciation of ordinary life, Avor received status, protection, and a functioning support network that often proved more reliable than anything the Soviet state itself provided to its own ordinary citizens on the outside. Think about how unusual this actually is as an organizational achievement. The Soviet government controlled the camps, controlled the guards, controlled the food, controlled the movement of every single prisoner within the wire. And despite all of that overwhelming institutional control, it never managed to control the culture developing inside its own walls. It's a bit like a company installing every security camera and every access badge system imaginable, and then discovering the employees have quietly formed their own union anyway, with its own bylaws, meeting in the break room the cameras happen not to cover. This mattered enormously once these prisoners were eventually released, because Avor didn't simply return to ordinary civilian life. He returned as a fully credentialed member of a criminal network that spanned an entire country's prison system, carrying status and connections built entirely inside institutions specifically designed to prevent exactly that kind of organizing from ever taking root. It's worth understanding how Laome's founding moment reflected a genuinely common pattern across prison-based organizations more broadly, one that recurs so consistently across different countries and different eras that it's almost become a predictable template. An organization begins as a genuinely defensive response to real, immediate danger, prisoners banding together, because the alternative is remaining isolated and vulnerable inside an environment where isolation itself can be lethal. Only later, once that defensive structure has proven durable and effective, does it gradually expand into something considerably more ambitious, extending its reach and its authority well beyond the original narrow purpose that justified its formation in the first place. This evolutionary pattern matters because it helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange about organizations like Laome. Why would a group formed specifically for mutual protection inside a single facility eventually develop the ambition and the genuine capability to extract tribute from gangs operating on the streets of an entire metropolitan region, gangs with no direct historical connection to the organization's original founding members at all? The answer lies in exactly this pattern of gradual, opportunistic expansion. Once a defensive structure exists, and once it has demonstrated genuine staying power and genuine internal discipline, the same underlying capabilities that made it effective for protection turn out to be equally transferable to considerably more ambitious, more profitable pursuits. It's worth comparing this to how many legitimate organizations follow a remarkably similar founding arc, starting as a narrow response to an immediate, specific problem before gradually expanding into something considerably larger and more ambitious once the founding structure has proven itself capable of sustaining that growth. Very few successful organizations, criminal or otherwise, actually begin with their eventual full scope of ambition clearly mapped out from day one. Most begin narrow, prove themselves at a small scale, and only then discover, often somewhat by accident, just how much further the underlying model can actually be stretched. There's a further detail about the tattoo system worth understanding, because it illustrates just how seriously this credentialing process was taken even in matters that might seem, from the outside, almost trivial. Certain tattoos were reserved specifically for prisoners who had served time in particular types of facilities, or who had survived specific, well-known hardships within the prison system, essentially creating a visual record of an individual's entire institutional biography, readable at a glance by anyone versed in the underlying code. A prisoner's body, quite literally, became his resume, his reference letter, and his verified employment history all at once, permanently displayed and permanently unforgeable in any meaningful sense. This visual permanence created a genuinely interesting problem for anyone who eventually left the criminal world behind, whether by choice or simply through age and exhaustion. Unlike a resume that can simply be updated or discarded, or a professional reputation that can gradually fade from memory once someone changes careers, these tattoos remained, marking their bearer permanently regardless of whether he ever wanted to return to that world again. Some former members reportedly went to extraordinary lengths, including painful removal procedures, specifically to escape the ongoing social and legal consequences of wearing symbols that continued announcing exactly who they had once been, long after they had genuinely stopped wanting that particular identity to define them. There's one more thread worth pulling on before leaving the Vori story behind, because it illustrates how thoroughly this culture reshaped incentives for prisoners who might otherwise have simply served their time quietly and moved on with ordinary lives afterward. Once status within this parallel society became genuinely valuable, carrying real protection and real standing that extended well beyond any individual sentence, prisoners had genuine incentive to actively seek out that status rather than avoid it, even when doing so meant extending their effective involvement in criminal life considerably longer than their original conviction alone would have required. A system built partly out of necessity, protection against a genuinely brutal camp environment, ended up creating its own self-perpetuating pull toward deeper, more permanent criminal involvement, an outcome nobody among the original founders likely intended, but one that shaped the culture's trajectory for generations afterward. It's worth digging a little deeper into exactly why Soviet camp authorities never managed to stamp out this parallel culture, despite having, on paper, nearly unlimited authority over every single aspect of a prisoner's daily existence. Part of the answer lies in simple scale. The Gulag system, at its peak, held millions of prisoners spread across an enormous, often remote geography, guarded by staff who were themselves frequently undertrained, underpaid, and in some documented cases barely better fed than the prisoners they were assigned to control. An authority this stretched thin simply could not monitor every single interaction happening inside every single camp closely enough to prevent an alternative culture from taking root somewhere within that vast system. But there's a second, more structural reason worth understanding too. Soviet camp authorities were, first and foremost, focused on labor extraction and basic order, not on the far more difficult task of actually reshaping prisoner values and prisoner culture from the ground up, keeping prisoners working, keeping them fed just enough to remain productive, and preventing large-scale organized violence or open rebellion consumed nearly all of the available institutional attention. The comparatively quieter, slower project of building an internal criminal code, enforced through tattoos and reputation rather than open confrontation, simply never registered as a priority worth dedicating scarce resources toward disrupting, at least not until the Vori network had already grown large and entrenched enough that disrupting it would have required a genuinely serious institutional commitment nobody in the Soviet prison bureaucracy was ultimately willing to make. This pattern, overworked and undertrained staff focused on basic order rather than deeper cultural containment, would repeat itself again and again across entirely different countries and entirely different prison systems throughout the rest of tonight's story. It's almost a universal law of institutional life. Any organization stretched thin enough on its primary mission will consistently deprioritize a secondary threat, right up until that secondary threat has grown large enough that it can no longer reasonably be ignored, at which point the cost of addressing it has usually grown substantially larger than it would have been at the very beginning. Among the Vori, status wasn't something you simply claimed for yourself. It had to be earned, verified, and crucially, displayed in a way that other prisoners across an entirely different camp, possibly thousands of miles away, could immediately understand and respect without a single word being spoken between them. The solution turned out to be tattoos, an entire visual language covering the body, encoding rank, achievements, time served, and specific crimes committed, all according to a shared symbolic code understood across the vast Soviet prison network. A cathedral tattoo might indicate years served. Stars on the shoulders or knees signaled leadership status within the criminal hierarchy. Certain specific images were reserved exclusively for those who had genuinely earned the right to wear them, and wearing one without having earned it carried consequences serious enough that very few prisoners risked the deception. This is, in its own strange way, an entire professional credentialing system, built without a single certificate, without a single database, without any centralized authority issuing the equivalent of a diploma. Imagine your entire employment history, every promotion, every major project, every year of tenure, permanently and visibly inked across your body in a code your coworkers can read at a glance, while your actual employer has absolutely no idea any of it exists or what any of it means. LinkedIn, in its wildest ambitions, has never achieved anything close to this level of instant, unforgeable credential verification. The tattoos served a second, equally important function beyond simple status display. They made the entire network legible to itself. A Vor transferred to a new camp, surrounded by strangers he had never met, could be read at a glance by the other prisoners around him. His rank and history immediately understood without requiring a single conversation. In a world where verbal claims about your own criminal history were cheap and easily faked, permanent, painful, visible ink turned out to be a remarkably difficult credential to counterfeit convincingly. It's worth examining more closely how this surcharge system actually got enforced in practice, because the mechanics reveal something genuinely important about how prison-based authority translates into street-level compliance without any direct physical presence at all. Enforcement rarely involved incarcerated leadership, personally identifying and punishing individual non-payers. Instead, it worked through a distributed system of reputation and consequence, where a street gang's own future members, upon eventual incarceration, would be held personally accountable for debts their gang had failed to honor while they were still free, regardless of whether that particular individual had personally been involved in the original decision not to pay. This created an unusual, genuinely effective form of collective responsibility that spread the consequences of non-payment across an entire gang's eventual prison population, rather than concentrating it on any single individual. A gang leader on the street, weighing whether to skip a payment, wasn't simply weighing his own personal risk. He was effectively gambling with the future safety of every current and future member of his own organization who might eventually end up incarcerated somewhere within Laimez's reach, a group considerably larger and considerably less able to personally consent to that particular risk than the leader making the actual decision on their behalf. This dynamic helps explain why compliance remained remarkably consistent across decades, despite the seemingly obvious observation that incarcerated leadership held no immediate physical power over anyone actually living free on the outside. The threat wasn't personal and immediate. It was structural and eventual, embedded into the very fabric of a criminal ecosystem, where prison wasn't a remote, unlikely possibility, but rather an expected, near-certain future for nearly everyone genuinely involved in that particular world. It's worth understanding, too, how Laimez's founding generation approached the question of internal governance, because the organization needed some mechanism for resolving disputes among its own senior figures, not just for extracting tribute from outside gangs. Early meetings among founding members, conducted under close observation from prison staff who had no idea what was actually being discussed, established basic rules for handling disagreements between members, allocating territory, and deciding how newly available criminal opportunities on the outside would be divided among competing factions within the organization itself. This internal governance layer often gets overlooked in popular accounts that focus primarily on the organization's external reach, its ability to tax street gangs and enforce compliance from behind bars. But the internal structure mattered just as much to the organization's long-term survival, because an organization capable of extracting tribute from outsiders, but incapable of managing disputes among its own senior leadership, would eventually fracture from within. Exactly the kind of internal breakdown examined in earlier episodes covering succession crises within other organized crime traditions. Laimez's founders, whether through careful design or simple accumulated trial and error, built governance structures resilient enough to avoid the worst of this particular failure mode for a genuinely long time. It's worth noting, finally, how this tattoo-based credentialing system eventually became a genuine liability for members trying to reintegrate into ordinary society decades later, once the Soviet Union itself had collapsed, and the broader social and economic conditions that had originally sustained this culture shifted dramatically. Symbols designed to be permanently unforgeable turned out to be permanently visible as well, marking their bearers in a rapidly changing world where the specific criminal reputation those symbols conveyed no longer carried the same practical value or the same practical necessity it once had inside the labor camps where the whole system had originally been built. The tattoo system's success ultimately depended on something almost paradoxical, a criminal culture achieving genuine, widespread standardization without any of the coordinating institutions that normally make standardization possible. No conference of camp leaders sat down and formally agreed on what a particular star pattern should mean. No central authority issued updated guidelines when new symbols emerged. The system simply propagated, camp to camp, prisoner to prisoner, through the same slow, organic process that spreads any folk tradition, refined constantly by the practical consequence of getting it wrong in a world where getting it wrong carried genuinely severe cost. This organic standardization is worth comparing to how language itself evolves and remains mutually intelligible across an enormous population, without any single grammar authority dictating correct usage in real time. Dictionaries and style guides, in most living languages, describe existing usage rather than truly controlling it, updated periodically to catch up with how people are already speaking. The Vori tattoo system worked on remarkably similar principles, a living, evolving code maintained through use rather than through decree, and it proved, across the very long span of decades this story has covered, considerably more durable than many far more formally administered credentialing systems ever managed to become. Cross an ocean and jump forward a few decades, and you find an almost eerily similar story unfolding for entirely unrelated reasons, inside a very different prison system. In 1957, inside Jewel Vocational Institution in California, a group of Mexican-American inmates formed an organization that would eventually become known as La Ame, the Mexican Mafia, built initially as a way to protect its members from the violence and exploitation of prison life more broadly. What started as a defensive alliance among a relatively small group of prisoners gradually evolved into something considerably more ambitious, a hierarchical criminal organization with genuine authority extending well beyond the walls of any single facility. And this is where the story takes its most consequential turn. La Ame didn't simply protect its own incarcerated members. It began asserting control over criminal activity happening outside prison entirely, on the streets of Southern California, among gangs that had no direct connection to the original founding members beyond a shared cultural and geographic identity. This arrangement worked through something close to a franchise model, not unlike the kind of distributed structure we've examined in other organized crime histories. Street-level gangs operating in Southern California were expected to pay a portion of their earnings, a tax often referred to within the culture as the surcharge, directly to incarcerated Mexican mafia leadership, in exchange for protection, mediation of disputes, and the simple avoidance of violent consequences that came with refusing to pay. It's worth sitting with how counterintuitive this arrangement actually is from a purely practical standpoint. You have a criminal organization whose most senior leadership is, by definition, in prison, physically incapable of enforcing anything directly on the street. And yet street gangs, operating with complete physical freedom and vastly more day-to-day flexibility than any incarcerated leader could ever possess, nonetheless paid up consistently, year after year. The incarcerated leadership held no direct physical power whatsoever. What it held was something considerably more durable, the near certain knowledge that eventually, through arrest or otherwise, every single street member would themselves end up inside a prison system where La Ame's influence was absolute and inescapable. It's worth understanding just how much genuine tradecraft developed around these low-tech communication methods over the decades, because what sounds, described briefly, like simple note passing actually involved considerable sophistication once you examine the details closely. Kites were often written in miniature script, sometimes using coded abbreviations understood only within a specific organization, and frequently concealed using methods designed specifically to survive a routine search, rolled tightly and hidden inside body cavities, dissolved temporarily in water and reconstituted later, or written using substances invisible, until treated with a specific reagent only the intended recipient would know to apply. Visitors, too, developed genuinely sophisticated methods for embedding coded information within conversations that would sound, to any guard monitoring the exchange, like nothing more than ordinary small talk between family members. A seemingly innocent question about a relative's health might actually be asking about the status of a specific shipment. A comment about weather conditions in a particular city might be relaying information about police activity in that same location. This kind of embedded coding required genuine coordination in advance, agreed upon before either party ever set foot in the visiting room, and it required both parties to maintain the discipline never to deviate from the established code, even under the pressure of an unexpected, difficult conversation happening in real time. It's worth comparing this to how modern intelligence agencies train operatives in exactly this kind of coded, plausible deniability communication, a discipline requiring years of practice to execute convincingly under genuine pressure. The organizations examined tonight developed remarkably similar tradecraft independently, through pure trial and error accumulated across generations of incarcerated members, without any formal training academy or shared manual, simply because the underlying problem, communicating sensitive information under close, hostile observation, produces remarkably similar solutions regardless of who happens to be solving it or why. It's worth examining how this system of collective responsibility interacted with the basic human tendency to discount future consequences relative to present ones, because this psychological dynamic actually made the surcharge system considerably more effective than it might initially appear on paper. Behavioral economists have long documented that people generally weigh distant future costs less heavily than immediate ones, which should, in theory, have made a distant, eventual prison consequence a relatively weak deterrent against skipping an immediate payment. Yet the system worked remarkably well in practice, largely because the eventual consequence wasn't actually distant or uncertain in the way most deferred consequences tend to be. For members of this particular criminal ecosystem, incarceration wasn't a remote possibility to be discounted the way a person might discount a retirement savings decision decades in the future. It was closer to a near certainty on a fairly predictable timeline, reducing the psychological distance that normally weakens deterrence based on delayed consequences. This is worth comparing to how insurance actuaries price risk differently depending on how certain and how imminent a particular outcome actually is. Consequence that feels genuinely inevitable, even if not immediate, tends to influence behavior considerably more powerfully than a consequence that feels merely theoretical or avoidable through sufficient luck or sufficient caution. Lahamet's model has since been studied, sometimes quite explicitly, by law enforcement analysts trying to understand comparable organizations forming in other countries and other prison systems entirely. The specific mechanics, defensive origin, gradual expansion into street-level taxation, enforcement through delayed rather than immediate consequence, have shown up in broadly similar form in organizations with no direct historical connection to Lahamet whatsoever, suggesting this particular model isn't so much a unique historical accident as a genuinely predictable solution that similar conditions tend to produce independently, wherever sufficiently large. Sufficiently organized incarcerated population faces a sufficiently long sentence structure to make this kind of patient, structural leverage worthwhile. Lahamet's specific origin story also compares to broader patterns of institution building under conditions of genuine scarcity and genuine danger. Organizations formed for pure survival, rather than for profit or ambition from the very outset, often display a kind of internal seriousness and internal discipline that purely opportunistic criminal ventures rarely match, precisely because the original stakes involved were quite literally life and death for the founding members rather than simply financial gain. This seriousness, once embedded into an organization's founding culture, tends to persist long after the original survival-level danger has eased, shaping decades of subsequent behavior, even once the organization has grown wealthy and powerful enough that the original defensive rationale barely applies anymore. This helps explain something that might otherwise seem strange about Lahamet's continued internal discipline decades after its founding, long after the original 1950s prison conditions that necessitated its formation had themselves evolved considerably. Institutions, much like individuals, tend to carry forward the habits and instincts formed during their most formative, highest-stakes early years, applying that same seriousness to circumstances the founders themselves could never have specifically anticipated. It's a genuinely durable inheritance, for better or worse, and it helps explain why an organization built initially around narrow survival eventually proved capable of sustaining something as ambitious and as far-reaching as citywide tribute collection decades later. That last point deserves its own careful unpacking, because it's genuinely the key to understanding how prison-based criminal authority manages to reach so far beyond prison walls in the first place. Lahamet's real leverage over street gangs never actually depended on incarcerated leaders somehow reaching out and directly punishing a member on the outside. It depended almost entirely on a simple statistical inevitability. In this particular criminal ecosystem, nearly everyone eventually goes to prison sooner or later for something. A street member who refused to pay the surcharge wasn't risking immediate retaliation delivered by phone or by message. He was risking his own eventual arrival inside a prison system where the consequences of that earlier refusal would be waiting for him, patiently, regardless of how much time had passed in the interim. This transformed prison itself from a simple punishment into something closer to a delayed, guaranteed collections mechanism, one that required no active enforcement effort at all until the debtor voluntarily walked back through the front gate himself. It's a genuinely unsettling comparison, but think about how differently modern debt collection works when the debtor knows, with near certainty, that he'll eventually end up back in a system where the creditor holds total control. A collections agency chasing an ordinary unpaid bill has to work fairly hard to track someone down, to apply pressure, to actually extract payment through legal or financial means that require real ongoing effort. L'Homé's system required none of that active pursuit. The gravitational pull of the prison system itself did the enforcement work automatically, over months or years, without a single incarcerated leader lifting a finger in the meantime. This dynamic explains something that puzzled outside observers for a long time. Why would gang members with total physical freedom continue paying tribute to leadership that couldn't reach them directly? The answer was never about the present moment. It was about the virtual certainty of a future moment, one everyone involved understood was coming, sooner rather than later, for almost everyone in this particular world. It's worth examining how the blood-in, blood-out principle actually functioned as an economic mechanism, not merely a cultural or symbolic one, because understanding it purely as intimidation misses something important about why it proved so durable. Every organization managing loyalty faces a fundamental problem economists sometimes call the commitment problem. How do you make a promise of future loyalty genuinely credible when the person making that promise could simply change their mind later, once circumstances shift, without facing any real consequence for doing so? The Aryan Brotherhood's entry requirement solved this commitment problem in about the most extreme way imaginable, by making the initial cost of joining and the cost of ever attempting to leave so severe that reneging on loyalty became essentially irrational for any individual member to even consider. This is structurally not entirely different from how legitimate businesses sometimes use substantial upfront costs, expensive equipment purchases, long-term contracts with significant penalty clauses, specialized training that has limited value anywhere else, to make an ongoing business relationship considerably more durable than a simple handshake agreement could ever achieve on its own. The difference, obviously, is that legitimate businesses generally cannot enforce these commitments through actual violence, while the Aryan Brotherhood's entire model depended precisely on that enforcement being genuinely credible and genuinely severe. This meant the organization needed remarkably little ongoing active management to maintain internal discipline, compared to organizations relying on softer, less absolute forms of loyalty. The commitment, once made, essentially enforced itself, freeing incarcerated leadership to focus considerably more of their limited attention on external opportunities and external threats, rather than on the constant internal policing that a less absolute loyalty structure would have required. It's worth adding a final layer to this discussion of prison communication tradecraft, because the methods described so far represent only the most commonly documented techniques, and investigators over the decades have uncovered considerably more elaborate variations as organizations adapted to increasingly sophisticated detection efforts. Some organizations developed rotating codes, changed on a predictable schedule known only to insiders, specifically to defeat the possibility that a single intercepted kite might reveal the underlying system for interpreting every future message as well. Others developed dead-drop style systems within the prison itself, designated hiding spots where a message could be left by one prisoner and retrieved later by another, without the two ever needing to interact directly at all, reducing the risk that a suspicious guard might notice a pattern of contact between two specific individuals. These increasingly sophisticated countermeasures illustrate something worth remembering throughout the rest of tonight's story. Every single communication method examined here existed specifically because a simpler, more obvious method had already been discovered and closed off by prison authorities at some earlier point. Tradecraft in this world, just as in professional intelligence work, evolves reactively. each new technique representing a direct response to whatever vulnerability the previous technique had already exposed, in a slow, ongoing cycle that never really produces a final, permanent solution for either side. It's worth adding one final note on this particular dynamic before moving forward, because it explains something that continues to puzzle observers encountering this story for the first time even today. The system worked, and continues working in various forms across various countries, not because any individual participant necessarily calculated the odds explicitly in the way just described. It worked because the surrounding culture simply treated the eventual consequence as background knowledge, absorbed the same way anyone absorbs an unwritten social rule long before ever consciously articulating it, which made the underlying deterrent considerably more powerful in daily practice than any purely rational calculation alone could have produced. This entire dynamic also reshaped incentives for law enforcement officials trying to disrupt the underlying system. If deterrence functioned primarily through delayed, near certain future consequence rather than immediate enforcement, disrupting the system required a fundamentally different strategy than simply catching individual violators in the act. Prosecutors eventually shifted toward targeting the underlying prison-based leadership structure directly, understanding that removing any single street-level enforcer accomplished relatively little against a system whose real power lay in the broader, distributed certainty of eventual incarceration, rather than in any specific individual actively watching and punishing violations day to day. This strategic shift from targeting individual violations toward targeting underlying structural leverage reflects a genuinely important lesson that recurs throughout tonight's entire story. Organizations built around structural, self-enforcing deterrence require structural countermeasures in response, not simply more aggressive enforcement of the same old individual-level violations that had never really been the actual source of the organization's power in the first place. Understanding this distinction and building policy around it rather than around a more intuitive, but ultimately less effective individual enforcement model took prosecutors and prison administrators considerably longer to fully grasp than the underlying mechanics themselves might suggest. None of this leverage means anything, though, without an actual functioning communication system, some reliable way for incarcerated leadership to issue instructions, resolve disputes, and receive information from a street network they could not see, hear, or directly contact through any officially sanctioned channel. And this is where prison organizations across many different countries and many different decades independently developed some genuinely remarkable low-tech solutions. The most basic version was the kite, a small, tightly folded note passed hand to hand between inmates, sometimes concealed inside ordinary objects, sometimes passed during the brief overlap of a shared exercise yard, sometimes smuggled through an intermediary during transport between facilities. A single kite might travel through a dozen different hands before reaching its intended recipient, each carrier trusted just enough to pass it along without reading it, or trusted just enough that reading it wouldn't matter even if he did. Visitors provided another crucial channel, and this is where prison rules designed to preserve basic human dignity, allowing inmates contact with family and legal counsel, created an unavoidable gap that organizations quickly learned to exploit. A visit that looked, to any casual observer, like an ordinary family conversation could carry coded instructions embedded in seemingly mundane small talk, agreed upon in advance, understood only by the people actually party to the arrangement. Compare this to how your own workplace handles internal communication today, with instant messaging apps, shared calendars, and email threads carrying a permanent, searchable record of every decision ever made. Prison-based criminal organizations built functioning, hierarchical communication networks using nothing but folded paper, careful timing, and an enormous amount of patience, moving information across hundreds of miles with a reliability that would genuinely impress anyone who has ever waited 3 days for a colleague to respond to a straightforward email. The genuinely remarkable part isn't any single method, it's the redundancy built into the whole system. If one channel got discovered and shut down, a kite intercepted, a visitor searched and questioned, the organization simply shifted its message through a different one, absorbing the loss without the underlying network itself ever actually breaking down. It's worth understanding the specific legal history behind 41 bis a little further, because the measure itself emerged only after a series of deeply consequential failures convinced Italian lawmakers that ordinary imprisonment simply could not contain organized crime leadership on its own. The measure gained its most significant political momentum following the 1992 assassinations of anti-mafia prosecutors Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, killings that shocked the Italian public into recognizing just how much operational reach imprisoned mafia leadership had genuinely retained, even from behind supposedly secure prison walls. This context matters because it illustrates a pattern that recurs throughout tonight's entire story: genuinely serious legal reform, closing the specific gaps organizations had spent years quietly exploiting, tends to arrive only after some dramatic, highly public failure makes the underlying problem impossible for lawmakers to continue ignoring. Incremental warning signs, however clear to investigators and prison administrators paying close attention, rarely generate the political will needed to pass genuinely restrictive new measures. It typically takes a genuine crisis, a prison break, a high-profile assassination, a scandal involving corrupt staff caught directly on camera, to finally overcome the legitimate objections raised by civil liberties advocates concerned about exactly how far these restrictive measures might eventually be extended. Even after its introduction, 41 bis remained genuinely controversial within Italy for decades, challenged repeatedly in court, modified several times in response to concerns about its severity, and studied closely by other countries weighing whether a similar approach might work within their own considerably different legal and constitutional traditions. It represents, in many ways, the most aggressive version of the isolation strategy examined throughout tonight's story, and its continued existence, alongside its continued controversy, reflects just how genuinely difficult it remains to strike a lasting balance between containing organizational influence and preserving basic prisoner rights. It's worth considering how this culture of enforced, permanent loyalty shaped the Aryan Brotherhood's relationship with rival organizations operating within the same prison system, because an organization built around absolute internal commitment tends to approach external negotiation quite differently than one with more flexible, situational loyalty among its members. Rival organizations negotiating with Aryan Brotherhood leadership generally understood they were dealing with commitments that would actually hold, precisely because the organization's own internal structure made backing out of an agreement nearly impossible for any individual member to unilaterally decide, regardless of his personal preference in the moment. This reliability, paradoxically, made the organization a genuinely useful negotiating partner for other groups within the prison system, despite its reputation for extreme violence. An agreement made with an organization whose internal discipline was absolute carried more practical weight than an agreement made with a looser, less disciplined group, where any individual member might simply decide, on his own initiative, to ignore the terms whenever it suited him personally. It's a strange kind of credibility, built entirely on extreme internal severity, but it functioned within this particular ecosystem in ways that a more conventional understanding of trust and reliability would never have predicted. These communication methods, however sophisticated they eventually became, still required something no amount of clever tradecraft could ever fully substitute for: genuine trust between the people passing information along an often lengthy chain of intermediaries. A kite passed through a dozen hands depended entirely on every single one of those hands remaining reliable, and organizations spent considerable effort cultivating exactly this kind of dependable internal trust, understanding correctly that even the cleverest coding system was only as strong as the weakest, least trustworthy link somewhere along its physical path. Redundancy itself turns out to be the single thread running through every communication method examined so far. No individual channel, whether a kite, a coded visit, or eventually a smuggled phone, needed to be perfectly secure on its own. What mattered was that the overall system offered enough alternative pathways that losing any single one never threatened the organization's ability to communicate entirely. This is a genuinely sophisticated design principle, one that modern engineers would recognize instantly from fields like network infrastructure or disaster recovery planning, where resilience comes not from making any single component unbreakable, but from ensuring the overall system can absorb the loss of individual components without catastrophic failure. It's worth sitting with how remarkable it is that this principle emerged independently, without any formal engineering training, purely through the accumulated trial and error of people whose primary motivation was simply staying connected to the outside world under genuinely difficult, genuinely hostile surveillance conditions. Necessity, in this case, just as in so many others throughout human history, produced a genuinely sophisticated solution long before anyone involved would have had the vocabulary to describe what they had actually built in these more formal, more technical terms. Every organization needs some form of enforcement to make its rules genuinely mean something, and prison-based criminal groups faced a peculiar challenge on this front. How do you maintain credible deterrence when your most senior leadership is confined to a single facility, unable to personally travel anywhere to enforce a rule? The Aryan Brotherhood, formed inside California's San Quentin prison in the 1960s, developed one particularly effective answer to this problem, built around a principle that became almost a founding doctrine within the organization: blood in, blood out. Membership required committing an act of violence to join, and leaving the organization alive was, according to the group's own internal culture, effectively not an option at all. This wasn't simply tough talk. It was a deliberate structural choice, designed to solve exactly the enforcement problem every prison-based organization eventually faces. By requiring genuine violence for entry, the organization ensured every single member had already demonstrated willingness to act on the group's behalf under real, personal risk, rather than simply claiming loyalty in the safety of ordinary conversation. And by making departure functionally impossible, the organization guaranteed that its rules didn't require constant active enforcement from leadership at all. The threat was baked permanently into membership itself, understood by everyone the moment they joined, rather than requiring an incarcerated boss to personally track down and punish every single act of disloyalty as it occurred. It's worth comparing this, uncomfortably, to how modern organizations attempt to build employee loyalty through far gentler mechanisms: vesting schedules, non-compete clauses, deferred bonuses that only pay out after several additional years of continued service. The underlying logic is remarkably similar in structure, even though the stakes involved could hardly be more different. Make leaving costly enough, make the entry commitment significant enough, and you dramatically reduce how much active daily enforcement effort loyalty actually requires from leadership going forward. This is ultimately what separated organizations that genuinely thrived from prison from organizations that quietly collapsed the moment their founders were incarcerated. Deterrence built into the structure itself, requiring no ongoing active effort to maintain, could survive years of separation from leadership. Deterrence that depended on a boss personally, actively enforcing every single rule in real time, could not survive that same separation for very long at all. It's worth considering how this specific vulnerability, attorney-client privilege used as a communication channel, compares to other trusted relationships that criminal organizations have historically exploited for similar purposes, because the underlying pattern extends well beyond legal representation specifically. Clergy visiting incarcerated members, for instance, have occasionally faced similar scrutiny in certain documented cases, given that religious counsel enjoys its own separate tradition of confidentiality in many legal systems. Medical consultations, too, involve a degree of privacy protection that has, in rare instances, been exploited in broadly similar ways. What unites all of these examples is a consistent underlying tension. Every genuinely important protected relationship, built specifically to encourage honest, unmonitored communication for entirely legitimate reasons, creates exactly the kind of gap a sufficiently motivated criminal organization can eventually learn to exploit. This isn't a flaw unique to any single profession or any single type of protected communication. It's a structural feature of any system that takes privacy and confidentiality seriously enough to actually protect it meaningfully, rather than merely paying lip service to the concept while quietly monitoring everything anyway. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it illustrates something genuinely difficult about the entire project of containing prison-based criminal organizations, without simultaneously eroding protections that serve entirely legitimate, important purposes for the overwhelming majority of prisoners who have no organizational ambitions whatsoever. Every proposed fix carries this same underlying trade-off, and lawmakers across the world have spent decades trying to calibrate exactly how much protection to preserve against exactly how much vulnerability that preserved protection inevitably creates, without ever quite landing on an answer that fully satisfies every legitimate concern simultaneously. It's worth examining how 41 bis specifically altered the daily texture of incarceration for the prisoners subjected to it, because understanding the granular detail helps explain why the measure proved so effective at severing communication channels that ordinary imprisonment had failed to close. Prisoners under this regime typically faced solitary confinement or housing with an extremely limited number of other prisoners, restricted to a single hour of outdoor exercise, monitored visits limited to a small number of pre-approved family members, and correspondence subject to review by judicial authorities before delivery, a level of restriction considerably beyond what ordinary Italian prisoners, even those convicted of serious violent crimes unrelated to organized crime, would typically experience. The measure's defenders have consistently argued that this severity is justified specifically because ordinary imprisonment had already been demonstrated, repeatedly and at real human cost, to be genuinely insufficient against organized crime leadership specifically, rather than representing an appropriate baseline for incarceration more broadly. Critics have countered that even this narrower justification doesn't fully address concerns about how the measure gets applied in practice, including documented cases where prisoners were held under this regime for extended periods despite limited or contested evidence that they remained genuinely active in directing outside criminal activity. This tension between demonstrated organizational threat and the human cost of the countermeasures designed to contain it runs through nearly every isolation strategy examined across tonight's entire story. The Aryan Brotherhood's model also illustrates something that applies well beyond organized crime specifically. Deterrence built into structure, requiring no active daily enforcement, tends to outlast deterrence that depends on someone constantly watching and constantly punishing. This is precisely why the organization survived so many years of sustained federal prosecution, efforts aimed squarely at dismantling its leadership. Removing any individual figure did remarkably little to weaken a loyalty structure that had never actually depended on that individual's constant personal oversight in the first place. The Aryan Brotherhood-specific model also compares to other prison organizations that attempted similarly absolute loyalty structures, but achieved considerably less durability over time. Not every organization that tried a blood-in, blood-out approach managed to sustain it successfully across multiple decades, and the difference often came down to consistency of internal enforcement during the organization's earliest, most vulnerable years. An absolute loyalty principle that gets quietly relaxed even once, for even one well-connected member facing unusual circumstances, tends to unravel considerably faster than most founders anticipate, because the entire deterrent value depends on the principle being seen as genuinely, uniformly absolute, rather than selectively enforced depending on who happens to be asking for an exception. The Aryan Brotherhood's relative success in maintaining this consistency, whatever moral judgment one might reasonably form about the organization itself, reflects a genuinely disciplined approach to institutional consistency that many far more conventional, far more legitimate organizations struggle to match even with considerably softer stakes involved. It's a useful, if uncomfortable, reminder that organizational durability and organizational virtue are entirely separate questions, and history offers no shortage of examples where the two have moved in genuinely opposite directions. Few examples illustrate the practical challenge of containing incarcerated criminal leadership better than Italy's long, frustrating experience with its own mafia bosses. For decades, senior figures within Sicily's Cosa Nostra continued directing extortion operations, ordering violence, and maintaining organizational discipline from inside ordinary Italian prisons, using many of the exact same low-tech communication methods already described. Coded messages passed during visits, instructions relayed through lawyers whose privileged communications were legally protected from routine surveillance, and a prison staff culture where selective corruption occasionally opened channels that should never have existed at all. Italian authorities eventually responded with a specific legal tool known as 41 bis, a special, considerably harsher prison regime reserved specifically for organized crime leadership, designed explicitly to sever exactly the communication channels ordinary imprisonment had failed to close. Under this regime, visits became sharply limited and closely monitored. correspondence faced intense scrutiny. Prisoners were isolated from the general population entirely, preventing the kind of informal kite-passing networks that had sustained communication in less restrictive facilities. It's genuinely remarkable that it took this long, and this much dedicated legal innovation, to arrive at a solution that sounds, on paper, fairly obvious. If a prisoner keeps running a criminal empire from his cell, perhaps the answer is simply to more thoroughly isolate him. The delay wasn't due to any lack of understanding about what was happening. It reflected genuine legal and constitutional tension between the ordinary rights afforded to any prisoner, including the right to family contact and confidential legal counsel, and the specific, demonstrated reality that certain prisoners had weaponized exactly those rights to continue directing serious criminal enterprises from behind bars. This tension between preserving basic prisoner rights and preventing the exploitation of those same rights would resurface again and again across different countries and different legal systems throughout the rest of this story, and it never really gets resolved cleanly. Every additional restriction imposed to close one channel raises a legitimate question about whether it goes too far, restricting rights for prisoners who genuinely aren't running anything at all, simply to close a gap being actively exploited by a much smaller number who are. It's worth understanding the specific economics that make phone smuggling such a persistently profitable enterprise for corrupt staff willing to take the risk, because the numbers involved help explain why enforcement alone has never fully solved the problem. A basic cell phone, worth perhaps a modest sum on the outside retail market, can command a price many multiples higher once successfully smuggled inside prison walls, reflecting both the genuine scarcity created by strict prohibition and the genuine value incarcerated organizational leadership places on real-time communication capability. This price premium creates a persistent, self-reinforcing incentive structure that prohibition alone has never fully disrupted, because the underlying economic logic remains constant regardless of how aggressively any single facility cracks down. Even if detection technology catches a meaningful percentage of smuggling attempts, the profit available on the attempts that succeed remains large enough to keep attracting new participants willing to accept the risk. Exactly the same basic dynamic that sustains illegal drug markets despite decades of aggressive enforcement effort directed against them. It's worth comparing this to how economists generally think about prohibition-driven markets more broadly, whether the specific product involved is a controlled substance, smuggled alcohol during an earlier era of prohibition, or in this case, a piece of ordinary consumer electronics rendered extraordinarily valuable purely through artificial scarcity. Prohibition raises price. Raised price attracts new suppliers willing to accept elevated risk in exchange for elevated reward. And absent some fundamental change in the underlying demand itself, this cycle tends to persist indefinitely, regardless of how much enforcement pressure gets applied against any single link in the supply chain. It's worth considering how the specific abuse of attorney-client privilege documented in various organized crime cases compares to how this same privilege gets discussed in entirely unrelated legal contexts, because the underlying vulnerability isn't actually unique to organized crime prosecutions at all. Corporate fraud investigations have occasionally encountered strikingly similar issues, where in-house counsel's privileged communications were later found to have facilitated ongoing misconduct, rather than simply providing legitimate legal advice about past or hypothetical future actions. Divorce and custody proceedings have, in rare documented instances, seen similar concerns raised about privileged communications being used to coordinate improper conduct rather than genuine legal strategy. What makes the organized crime context particularly significant, though, is simply the scale and sophistication involved, given that a well-resourced criminal organization has genuine financial capacity to identify and cultivate relationships with attorneys willing to cross this particular line, in a way that most individuals facing more ordinary legal circumstances simply don't have the resources to attempt. This resource asymmetry helps explain why organized crime specifically has generated so much of the legal precedent and so much of the specific regulatory attention devoted to monitoring exactly this particular vulnerability, even though the underlying structural weakness exists, in principle, wherever privileged communication meets sufficient financial incentive to abuse it. Italy's experience with 41 bis has since informed prison policy discussions well beyond its own borders, studied by justice ministries in several other countries wrestling with broadly similar organized crime containment problems. Few countries have adopted anything quite as severe in its exact form, reflecting genuinely different legal traditions and genuinely different tolerances for restrictive incarceration. But the underlying lesson, that ordinary imprisonment alone had proven demonstrably insufficient against sufficiently organized, sufficiently wealthy criminal leadership, resonated well beyond Italy's own specific legal and political context. It's worth adding a broader reflection here on how 41 bis fits into the wider European conversation about balancing security and prisoner rights, a conversation that has grown considerably more sophisticated in the decades since the measure's original introduction. The European Court of Human Rights has, on several occasions, reviewed specific applications of the measure, generally upholding its basic legitimacy while pushing back against particular instances where its application seemed disconnected from genuine, ongoing evidence of organizational activity. This ongoing judicial oversight represents a genuinely important check on how far isolation-based strategies can be extended without meaningful evidence, a check that many of the other countries in this story have developed less formally or less consistently over the same period. This comparative dimension matters because it illustrates just how differently various legal traditions have approached the same underlying tension between containment and rights preservation. Some systems lean more heavily toward administrative discretion, trusting prison officials to apply restrictive measures judiciously without extensive judicial review. Others, like Italy's approach under sustained European court oversight, build in considerably more formal, ongoing scrutiny. Neither approach has proven definitively superior, and the debate between them continues to shape prison policy discussions well beyond the specific case of organized crime containment that originally motivated 41 bis in the first place. Step back for a moment and consider just how strange it is that lawyer-client privilege, one of the most carefully protected principles in nearly every modern legal system, became one of the single most reliable communication channels for incarcerated organizers looking to keep running their operations undetected. The underlying logic behind this privilege is entirely reasonable on its own terms. A defendant needs to be able to speak completely honestly with his own attorney, without fear that anything said will be reported to prosecutors or used against him later. Undermine that trust, and the entire adversarial legal system built around genuine defense representation starts to break down. This is a genuinely important protection, and removing it carelessly would create serious problems, extending far beyond organized crime specifically. But a small number of attorneys, across many different countries and many different decades, have been found willing to abuse exactly this protection, knowingly carrying messages between an incarcerated client and outside associates under the legal cover attorney-client privilege provided. It's a bit like discovering that your company's confidential HR complaint line, specifically protected to encourage honest reporting without fear of retaliation, has occasionally been used by a small number of employees to quietly coordinate something considerably less innocent than a genuine workplace grievance, entirely protected by the same confidentiality designed to serve a completely different, genuinely important purpose. Prosecutors and prison authorities have responded to this specific vulnerability with real caution, because the fix is never as simple as it initially sounds. You cannot simply eliminate attorney-client privilege for organized crime defendants without creating a genuinely dangerous precedent that could eventually be applied far more broadly than originally intended. Instead, the response has generally involved narrower, more targeted measures, monitoring specific attorneys with documented histories of abuse, requiring supervised legal visits in the most extreme cases, and pursuing separate criminal charges against the small number of lawyers actually caught knowingly facilitating this kind of communication. This whole episode is a genuine reminder that closing a security gap inside a criminal justice system rarely means simply flipping a single switch. Nearly every fix available comes bundled with a genuine cost to rights and protections that exist for entirely legitimate reasons, and striking the right balance has occupied lawmakers and prison administrators across the world for decades, without anyone ever quite arriving at a solution that fully satisfies everyone involved. It's worth considering how Guzman's specific case illustrates a broader truth about modern cartel structure that distinguishes it meaningfully from some of the earlier, more centralized organizations examined earlier in tonight's story. The Sinaloa cartel, by the time of Guzman's final capture and extradition, had already evolved into something considerably closer to a loose federation of semi-independent cells than a strictly hierarchical organization dependent on a single figure's constant, direct oversight. This structural evolution, whether deliberate or simply the accumulated result of decades of operating under sustained law enforcement pressure, turned out to be precisely the kind of organizational resilience that allowed the cartel to weather Guzman's repeated periods of incarceration without ever genuinely collapsing. This is worth comparing directly to the franchise-style structure examined in earlier episodes on this channel covering Yakuza organizational history, because the underlying logic is remarkably similar despite the enormous cultural and geographic distance separating these two very different criminal traditions. Organizations that distribute genuine operational authority across multiple semi-independent nodes, rather than concentrating it entirely in a single central figure, consistently prove more resilient against exactly the kind of disruption incarceration represents, precisely because no single arrest, however significant the individual involved, can eliminate every node simultaneously. Guzman's eventual life sentence in a maximum security American facility represents, by any reasonable measure, close to the most complete physical isolation modern law enforcement can realistically impose on any individual. And yet the Sinaloa cartel itself continued operating well beyond his incarceration, a genuinely striking illustration of just how thoroughly the underlying organizational structure, rather than any single individual's continued freedom, had come to determine the enterprise's actual long-term survival. It's worth understanding the broader technological arms race surrounding contraband phones a bit further, because detection methods themselves have evolved considerably beyond simple physical searches conducted by hand. Modern facilities increasingly deploy specialized equipment capable of detecting the specific radio signals cell phones emit, sometimes combined with deliberately jammed zones intended to render any successfully smuggled phone functionally useless, even if it evades physical discovery entirely. Some jurisdictions have experimented with managed access systems, essentially creating a controlled cellular network within the prison itself that intercepts and blocks unauthorized devices while still permitting officially sanctioned communication to pass through normally. These technological countermeasures represent a genuinely significant escalation in cost and complexity compared to the simple pat-down searches that once represented the primary defense against phone smuggling. And this escalation itself illustrates something worth remembering about the entire contest examined throughout tonight's story. Each new detection technology forces smuggling operations to become correspondingly more sophisticated in turn, whether through better concealment methods, more creative smuggling routes, or simply accepting a higher failure rate in exchange for the substantial profit available whenever an attempt actually succeeds. Neither side of this particular contest has ever achieved a permanent, decisive advantage over the other for very long. It's worth adding a broader reflection on what this particular vulnerability reveals about the limits of purely legal solutions to what is, at its core, a problem of trust and verification. No law can fully distinguish, in advance, between an attorney genuinely providing legitimate counsel and one knowingly facilitating ongoing criminal coordination, without some further evidence beyond the mere fact of privileged communication having occurred. This leaves enforcement dependent, in practice, on catching abuse after the fact, through independent evidence, rather than preventing it through the privilege rule itself, a genuinely uncomfortable but largely unavoidable limitation, given how important the underlying protection remains for the overwhelming majority of prisoners who never abuse it at all. The broader legal profession itself has responded to these documented cases of privilege abuse, beyond the specific narrow countermeasures prosecutors and prison authorities have deployed. Bar associations in several countries have introduced additional ethical training and additional reporting requirements specifically addressing this vulnerability, recognizing that the profession's own credibility depends on visibly, actively policing the small number of practitioners willing to abuse a protection that exists for entirely legitimate reasons, serving the overwhelming majority of clients and cases. This self-regulatory response matters because it represents a genuinely different kind of countermeasure than the purely legal or purely institutional responses examined elsewhere in tonight's story, one driven by professional self-interest in maintaining public trust rather than purely by external legal pressure. Whether self-regulation alone proves sufficient to meaningfully reduce this particular vulnerability remains, honestly, an open question, but it does illustrate how a problem this structurally difficult tends to draw responses from multiple different directions simultaneously: legal, institutional, and professional, none of them fully sufficient alone, but each addressing a slightly different piece of a genuinely difficult, multifaceted puzzle. Eventually, low-tech kites and coded visitor conversations gave way to something considerably more direct: the smuggled cell phone, and its arrival transformed prison-based criminal communication almost overnight, in a way centuries of folded paper messages never quite managed to achieve on their own. Contraband phone, smuggled inside a facility through corrupt staff, thrown over a perimeter fence, or concealed inside seemingly ordinary packages, gave an incarcerated leader something entirely new: the ability to communicate in real time, with genuine two-way conversation, rather than relying on messages that might take days or weeks to travel through a chain of intermediary hands. Suddenly, a boss could receive updates, issue instructions, and resolve urgent disputes within minutes, rather than waiting for the next scheduled visit or the next opportunity to pass a note during a shared exercise period. Prison systems worldwide have responded with an ongoing, genuinely expensive technological arms race that shows no real sign of ending. Cell phone detection equipment, deliberately jammed signal zones surrounding sensitive facilities, and increasingly aggressive searches targeting exactly this kind of contraband have all become standard features of modern high-security prison operations, at real and substantial cost to already strained prison budgets. And yet the phones keep arriving, year after year, through an endless combination of corrupt staff members, creative smuggling methods, and the simple, persistent economic reality that a working phone commands an enormous premium price inside prison walls, more than enough to make smuggling one worthwhile for anyone willing to accept the very real risk involved. It's worth comparing this to how any black market functions when demand remains genuinely high and enforcement remains genuinely imperfect. Prohibition alone rarely eliminates a market entirely. It simply raises the price, and the profit available at that higher price continues attracting new suppliers willing to accept the increased risk in exchange for increased reward. It's worth understanding how this informal currency system managed to maintain relatively stable, consistent values across an entire facility, and often across multiple facilities within the same broader prison system, despite having no central bank, no official exchange rate, and no formal mechanism for actually enforcing agreed-upon prices beyond simple, continuously reinforced social consensus. A pack of a particular commissary item became worth roughly a certain number of stamps, which became worth roughly a certain amount of a particular service, and these informal exchange rates, remarkably, tended to hold reasonably steady over extended periods, adjusted gradually only when genuine supply or demand shifts justified a change. This stability matters enormously for our broader story, because a currency system prone to wild, unpredictable fluctuation would have made it considerably harder for organizations to actually conduct reliable business using it. Debts needed to hold their value over the weeks or months it might take to actually settle them. Prices for protection or for smuggled goods needed to remain predictable enough that both parties to a transaction could reasonably plan around them. The fact that these informal systems achieved this kind of practical stability, without any of the institutional infrastructure modern economies typically rely on to maintain currency stability, central banks, regulated exchanges, legal enforcement of contracts, represents a genuinely impressive achievement of pure decentralized social consensus, repeated independently across countless different facilities and countless different eras of prison history. It's worth understanding, too, how Guzman's specific pattern of repeated escape and eventual recapture shaped Mexican and American law enforcement cooperation over the following years, because his case became something of a defining example used to justify increasingly aggressive extradition policies for high-profile cartel leadership. Mexican authorities, having witnessed firsthand just how unreliable domestic maximum security facilities had proven against an organization with this much financial resource and this much local influence, became considerably more willing to extradite significant cartel figures to American custody, where facilities generally offered fewer opportunities for the kind of large-scale corruption and elaborate escape planning that had twice succeeded within the Mexican prison system. This shift represented a genuinely significant change in how the two countries approached organized crime enforcement cooperation, driven substantially by the specific, highly public failures Guzman's case represented. It's worth comparing this to how any institution eventually updates its own policies following a sufficiently dramatic, sufficiently public failure, often adopting considerably more aggressive countermeasures than would have seemed politically feasible before that particular failure occurred. Guzman's escapes, embarrassing as they were for Mexican authorities in the moment, ultimately reshaped an entire international enforcement relationship in ways that outlasted his own individual case by a considerable margin. The underlying contest over contraband phones has, in a strange way, mirrored broader societal debates about privacy and security technology more generally, where every advance in detection capability raises genuine questions about proportionality and cost, both financial and otherwise. Prison systems, forced to spend increasingly large shares of already limited budgets on this particular arms race, have had to make difficult choices about how much of their overall resources this single, narrow problem genuinely deserves relative to every other competing demand a modern correctional system faces on any given day. One final comparison is worth sitting with here. Every prohibition-driven black market, whether it involves smuggled phones, controlled substances, or historically, alcohol during an earlier era of American prohibition, tends to follow the same predictable arc. Initial prohibition, initial price spike, gradual adaptation by suppliers willing to accept the elevated risk, and eventually a kind of uneasy equilibrium, where enforcement catches a meaningful but incomplete share of attempts, never quite eliminating the underlying market, simply making it more expensive and more dangerous to participate in. Contraband phones inside prison walls have settled into almost exactly this same equilibrium, year after year, across nearly every country that has seriously studied the problem. The economics of contraband phones have also shifted as the underlying technology itself has evolved. Early mobile phones, bulky and expensive even on the outside retail market, were considerably harder to conceal and considerably more costly to replace if confiscated. Modern smartphones, smaller, cheaper, and vastly more capable, have paradoxically made both smuggling and detection efforts more complex simultaneously, easier to physically conceal given their reduced size, but also easier for detection technology to identify given the more distinctive, more consistent radio signatures modern devices tend to produce compared to older analog technology. This evolving technological landscape means the underlying arms race shows no sign of settling into any permanent equilibrium, contrary to what a purely economic analysis might initially suggest. Each new generation of consumer technology introduces new variables into a contest that has already run for decades without producing a clear, lasting winner on either side. And there's little reason, based on the pattern examined throughout tonight's entire story, to expect that dynamic to change anytime particularly soon. Perhaps no single figure illustrates the practical limits of prison containment better than Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the longtime leader of Mexico's Sinaloa cartel, whose criminal career included not one but two escapes from maximum security Mexican prisons, alongside extended periods where cartel operations continued functioning smoothly regardless of his incarceration status at any given moment. Guzman's first escape, in 2001, reportedly involved a laundry cart and extensive prison staff corruption. His second, in 2015, involved something considerably more elaborate, a mile-long tunnel, engineered with genuine precision, running directly beneath his cell to an unfinished house outside the prison perimeter, complete with rail tracks and lighting, representing a level of resources and planning that only an organization with the cartel's genuine wealth and reach could realistically have assembled. But the more instructive part of this story, for our purposes tonight, isn't the escapes themselves. It's what happened during the periods Guzman actually remained securely incarcerated, both in Mexico and, following his eventual extradition, in the United States. The Sinaloa cartel, throughout these periods, did not simply collapse or grind to a halt waiting for his return. Trusted lieutenants continued day-to-day operations, supply chains kept functioning, and the organization's core structure remained largely intact, precisely because a well-run criminal enterprise, much like the franchise-style Yakuza structure examined in earlier episodes on this channel, was never entirely dependent on any single individual maintaining constant, direct control over every single decision. This is worth comparing to how any well-managed modern company handles the sudden, unplanned absence of its founding leader, through illness, legal trouble, or simple retirement. A company that collapses the moment its founder steps away was never genuinely well organized to begin with, no matter how impressive its numbers looked while that individual remained actively involved. Company, or in this case a cartel, that continues functioning smoothly during an extended leadership absence has, whether anyone involved would ever use this particular language, actually built genuine organizational resilience into its underlying structure. Guzman's eventual extradition to the United States and his subsequent life sentence in one of the country's most secure facilities represented a genuine personal defeat. It did not represent the end of the organization he had spent decades building. It's worth examining how prison systems have attempted to address staff corruption through structural changes to the job itself, rather than simply relying on background checks and after-the-fact investigation once corruption has already been discovered. Some facilities have experimented with meaningfully higher compensation, specifically for staff working in the most sensitive security roles, on the theory that raising the cost of corruption relative to the potential bribe could shift the underlying economic calculation enough to reduce the temptation. Others have focused on reducing the length of time any single guard spends supervising the same specific unit or the same specific prisoners, on the theory that corruption tends to develop gradually, through relationships built slowly over extended, repeated contact, and disrupting that continuity disrupts the relationship-building process corruption typically depends on. Neither approach has proven fully sufficient on its own, and most serious prison reform efforts eventually combine several overlapping strategies simultaneously rather than relying on any single fix. This mirrors in many ways how legitimate industries facing similar insider threat problems, banking, cybersecurity, high-value logistics, have generally arrived at broadly similar conclusions. No single countermeasure fully eliminates the underlying temptation, and genuine resilience against insider threats typically requires layering multiple, partially overlapping safeguards, accepting that some meaningful percentage of corruption will likely persist regardless, while working continuously to reduce that percentage as much as realistically achievable given genuine budget and staffing constraints. It's worth considering how this informal currency system eventually intersected with, and in some cases directly enabled, the more sophisticated organizational financing examined elsewhere in tonight's story. Debts owed in commissary goods or cigarettes could, in more developed criminal economies within a given facility, eventually be converted into obligations payable in actual outside currency once a debtor was released, essentially allowing organizations to extend credit inside prison walls that would eventually be collected through entirely conventional means once the debtor returned to ordinary civilian life. This created a genuine bridge between the isolated, closed economy operating inside prison walls and the considerably larger, more conventional criminal economy operating outside them. This bridging function mattered enormously for organizations seeking to maintain financial continuity across the constant churn of members entering and leaving the prison system on an ongoing basis. A purely internal currency, however stable, would have limited value if it couldn't eventually connect to resources and obligations existing outside prison walls entirely. The organizations that managed this conversion most effectively, treating internal prison debts as genuinely enforceable obligations extending well beyond any individual member's eventual release date, built considerably more durable, more genuinely economically integrated criminal enterprises than organizations that treated prison-based debts as somehow separate or less binding than obligations incurred anywhere else. It's worth returning briefly to Guzman's own personal fate, currently serving a life sentence with no realistic possibility of release, held under conditions specifically designed, informed by decades of accumulated lessons from cases just like his own, to prevent any third escape attempt. His personal story ends, by any reasonable measure, in genuine defeat. The organization's story does not end there at all, a distinction worth sitting with as we move toward the broader economic and institutional systems examined next, covering the broader economic and institutional systems that allow organizations like his to outlast any single leader's freedom. It's worth adding a final reflection on what Guzman's case reveals about the limits of treating any single individual as the true target of an organized crime containment strategy. Law enforcement resources, understandably, tend to concentrate heavily on capturing and prosecuting the most visible, most symbolically significant leadership figures, and there are genuinely good reasons for this focus, both in terms of public accountability and in terms of the specific criminal liability that senior leadership actually holds. But the central lesson here, that organizational survival depended far more on structure than on any single figure's continued freedom, suggests that celebrating a high-profile capture as a decisive victory against the underlying organization often overstates what has actually been accomplished. This distinction between symbolic victory and structural disruption matters enormously for how the rest of tonight's story should be understood, because it reframes the entire question this documentary has been circling from the very beginning. The real challenge was never simply capturing any single boss, however dramatic and however well-earned that particular capture might genuinely be. It was disrupting an underlying structure specifically built, often quite deliberately, to survive exactly that kind of individual loss without ever missing much of a beat. Every functioning economy needs some medium of exchange, and prisons, cut off from ordinary currency by design, have consistently developed their own informal systems remarkably fast, regardless of country, regardless of era, almost as though the human impulse toward trade simply cannot be fully suppressed no matter how controlled the surrounding environment happens to be. For much of American prison history, cigarettes functioned as the closest thing to a reliable, widely accepted currency, valued consistently enough that prices for various goods and services could be reliably quoted in cigarette terms across an entire facility, understood by everyone regardless of which specific criminal organization they happened to be affiliated with. As many facilities gradually became smoke-free environments, commissary items, ramen noodles, stamps, and other small, tradable goods increasingly took over this same basic economic function, valued not primarily for their actual use, but for their reliable, widely recognized worth as a medium of exchange. This informal economy matters enormously to our broader story, because criminal organizations operating from behind bars needed exactly this kind of functioning internal currency to actually operate as businesses in any meaningful sense. Debts needed to be trackable. Payments needed to be verifiable. Services, from basic protection to smuggled contraband, needed a genuinely reliable pricing mechanism that could function consistently across an entire facility, and eventually across multiple facilities within the same prison system. It's worth comparing this to how remarkably quickly any isolated human community, cut off from conventional currency for whatever reason, tends to reinvent something functionally equivalent almost immediately, whether that's cigarettes in an American prison, chocolate, and cigarettes famously trading as currency inside World War II prisoner of war camps, or countless other historical examples of exactly the same underlying pattern repeating itself. Take away conventional money, and people don't simply stop trading. They agree, remarkably quickly, on some substitute that will do the job just as effectively, usually without any formal negotiation required at all. It's worth considering how this portable membership model changed the basic calculation facing law enforcement agencies trying to disrupt these organizations, because a portable structure fundamentally undermines strategies built around targeting any single facility or any single regional leadership cell. Shut down organizational activity within one specific prison, and members simply reconnect with the same organization's local branch at whatever facility they're eventually transferred to next, carrying their earned status and their existing relationships with them across state lines and across security classifications with remarkably little friction. This portability also created a genuinely unusual recruitment dynamic worth understanding, because it meant an organization's reach effectively extended into facilities it had never previously operated in directly, the moment even a single established member arrived there through the ordinary, unpredictable machinery of prison transfers. A single transferred member, carrying genuine standing within the wider organization, could establish an entirely new local branch within months, recruiting from an entirely new population of prisoners who might never otherwise have encountered the organization at all, simply because the underlying structure was flexible enough to expand organically, one transfer at a time, without requiring any centralized planning or centralized resource investment to make that expansion happen. These informal currency systems have, in more recent years, begun facing an entirely new kind of disruption. The same contraband phones examined earlier increasingly enable prisoners to coordinate financial transactions through outside intermediaries, mobile payment apps, and cryptocurrency transfers arranged by associates on the outside, gradually supplementing, and in some documented cases beginning to replace, the older cigarette and commissary economy that had functioned reliably for the better part of a century. Whether this newer, more digitally connected system proves as durable as its analog predecessor remains, at this point, a genuinely open question. It's worth adding one more dimension to this currency story before moving on, because the stability of these informal systems depended on something easy to overlook: shared, universally understood scarcity. Cigarettes worked as currency precisely because everyone inside a given facility wanted them, and few could produce or acquire them independently, the same basic condition that has underpinned functioning currencies throughout human history, going back long before anyone thought to print an official banknote. Remove that shared scarcity, flood a facility with an item everyone can easily obtain another way, and the informal exchange rate built around it collapses almost overnight, forcing the underlying economy to quickly settle on some new scarce good to take its place. Prison economies, in this sense, behave like currency markets anywhere else, responding to supply and demand shifts with remarkable speed, even without any of the institutional infrastructure ordinary economies rely on to manage exactly that kind of adjustment. This also explains why prison administrators occasionally found themselves able to disrupt organizational financing indirectly, simply by changing commissary policy, restricting or expanding access to whichever specific item had become the dominant local currency at a given facility. A policy change intended purely as routine administrative housekeeping could, almost accidentally, destabilize an entire informal economy that had taken years to establish, forcing organizations to rebuild their financial infrastructure around whatever new scarce good happened to fill the resulting gap. It's a reminder that even the most entrenched informal systems remain, in the end, dependent on conditions prison administrators retain at least partial control over, even when they don't fully realize the downstream effect a seemingly minor policy adjustment might end up having. One final comparison is worth sitting with here, because prison currency systems offer a genuinely useful lens for understanding how value itself gets established in any economy, formal or informal, official or entirely improvised. Economists have long debated exactly what gives any currency its underlying worth, whether it's backed by some tangible commodity, guaranteed by government authority, or simply sustained through widespread collective belief that others will continue accepting it in exchange for genuine goods and services. Prison economies, stripped of nearly every conventional source of currency legitimacy, government backing, physical commodity value beyond simple consumption, demonstrate perhaps the purest possible test case for this last explanation. Currency works fundamentally because enough people simply agree that it does, and that agreement alone proves remarkably resilient once firmly established. This observation extends well beyond prison walls, offering a genuinely useful frame for thinking about how any economy, including the much larger, much more formally structured ones operating outside prison entirely, ultimately depends on exactly this same underlying foundation of collective, continuously renewed trust. However much additional institutional machinery gets layered on top of that basic foundation in more conventional economic contexts. None of the systems described so far, the kites, the phones, the coded visits, the internal currency, would function nearly as reliably without one final, uncomfortable ingredient: at least some degree of cooperation, whether active or simply willfully passive, from the prison staff specifically employed to prevent exactly this kind of activity from ever taking place. Guard corruption inside prison systems takes many different forms, ranging from the relatively minor, a small bribe to look away from an obvious rule violation, to the genuinely serious, active participation in smuggling contraband or relaying messages directly on an organization's behalf. The underlying economics driving this corruption are, frankly, not especially mysterious once you look at them honestly. Prison guard positions are, in most countries, modestly compensated relative to the genuine risk and stress involved in the job, while the sums criminal organizations can offer in exchange for cooperation are often, by comparison, genuinely substantial. This creates exactly the kind of persistent temptation that no amount of official policy alone has ever fully eliminated in any prison system studied closely enough. Background checks, staff rotation policies designed to prevent overly familiar relationships from forming, and increased surveillance of staff behavior have all been deployed as countermeasures with varying degrees of genuine success. But the fundamental economic incentive underneath the problem has never been fully removed by any of these measures on their own. It's worth comparing this, uncomfortably, to how any organization managing valuable assets with underpaid staff eventually discovers some meaningful percentage of security failures traced back to insider cooperation rather than purely external breach. Security experts across many entirely unrelated industries, banking, corporate data protection, high-value shipping, and logistics, consistently identify the same basic vulnerability. The most sophisticated external security measures in the world mean relatively little if the people actually staffing the system can be persuaded, through sufficient financial incentive, to simply open the door themselves. It's worth understanding, too, that isolation as a strategy carries genuine financial costs that extend well beyond the psychological toll on the prisoners subjected to it. Costs that have made the widespread application of extended solitary confinement an increasingly difficult policy to sustain purely on budgetary grounds, independent of any moral or legal objection. Housing a prisoner in solitary confinement typically requires meaningfully more staff resources per prisoner than housing that same individual within the general population, given the additional security protocols, additional individual meal delivery, and additional individual exercise scheduling extended isolation typically requires. This cost dimension has driven a genuine shift in recent years toward more narrowly targeted isolation policies, reserving the most extreme measures specifically for prisoners with documented evidence of ongoing organizational leadership activity, rather than applying broad isolation policies across a considerably wider population on a purely precautionary basis. This narrower targeting reflects a genuine, if incomplete, attempt to balance the demonstrated need for containing specific organizational threats against both the well-documented psychological harm and the genuinely substantial financial cost that broader, less targeted isolation policies impose on already strained prison system budgets. It's worth stepping back to consider just how differently this portable membership model looks compared to how legitimate professional credentials transfer between locations, because the comparison highlights something genuinely distinctive about what these organizations actually built. Professional license, a medical degree, a trade certification, generally transfers between jurisdictions only through formal bureaucratic processes. Applications, verification requests sent to the original issuing authority, sometimes additional testing required before the credential carries full weight in a new location. The organizations examined tonight built something functionally similar, verifiable status recognized reliably across an entire dispersed network, but they built it entirely without any of that bureaucratic infrastructure, relying instead on tattoos, reputation, and word passed through trusted intermediaries. This absence of formal bureaucracy turned out to be a genuine strength rather than a weakness, precisely because bureaucracy creates exactly the kind of paper trail law enforcement investigators are specifically trained to follow. A formal membership database, however useful it might have been for internal organizational purposes, would have handed prosecutors an enormously valuable piece of evidence the moment it was ever discovered during a raid. The informal reputation-based system these organizations relied on instead left considerably less behind for investigators to seize, precisely because so much of the actual verification process lived inside the memories and social networks of the members themselves, rather than in any physical or digital record that could simply be confiscated and read by outsiders. It's worth an honest acknowledgement that corruption countermeasures, however well designed, have never fully eliminated this particular vulnerability in any prison system studied closely enough to draw a reliable conclusion. What has changed gradually is simply the sophistication of detection efforts and the severity of consequences once corruption is actually uncovered, shifting the underlying risk calculation somewhat without ever eliminating the fundamental economic incentive that makes this particular temptation persistent across every country and every era in this story. It's worth adding a further layer to the corruption story before moving on, because financial incentive, while significant, rarely tells the entire picture on its own. Investigators studying documented corruption cases have consistently found that relationship building, not simple bribery, often represents the more common and more effective pathway toward compromising staff. A guard gradually drawn into small, seemingly harmless favors, passing an unremarkable message, allowing a slightly extended visit, tends to find each subsequent request slightly easier to justify than the last, a slow erosion of boundaries that rarely begins with any large, obviously compromising initial payment at all. This gradual pattern mirrors recruitment techniques used across entirely unrelated contexts, from corporate espionage to more conventional intelligence work, where a target is rarely asked to cross a major line immediately. Instead, trust is built incrementally, through a series of small, individually defensible steps, until the cumulative relationship has quietly become something the person involved would never have agreed to if asked directly at the very beginning. Prison systems that have taken this pattern seriously have shifted training accordingly, teaching new staff specifically to recognize and refuse even the smallest, most seemingly innocent early requests, understanding that the danger rarely announces itself clearly on day one. It's worth a final reflection on how deeply this insider threat vulnerability connects to broader questions about institutional trust more generally. Every system that depends on human staff to enforce its rules faces some version of exactly this same underlying risk, and the specific dollar amounts and specific consequences vary enormously across different contexts, but the fundamental economic and psychological mechanics remain remarkably consistent. A person trusted with meaningful authority, facing genuine financial pressure or genuine gradual relationship building from a sufficiently patient, sufficiently well-resourced adversary, will, in some documented percentage of cases across every industry studied closely enough, eventually compromise that trust. Prison systems have simply had more occasion than most institutions to study this particular vulnerability in close, sustained detail, given how directly and how persistently organized crime has targeted exactly this weakness over so many decades. The lessons learned within corrections, imperfect and incomplete as they remain, have increasingly informed insider threat policy in entirely unrelated fields, a genuinely interesting example of how deeply specialized knowledge developed to solve one particular institutional problem eventually finds application well beyond the specific context that originally produced it. As prison-based organizations matured, many of them solved a genuinely difficult logistical problem. How do you maintain consistent standards, consistent loyalty, and consistent enforcement across an organization whose membership is constantly being shuffled between different facilities, different states, and different security levels, entirely outside the organization's own control? The answer, in many cases, echoed the same franchise-style structure examined in earlier episodes covering Yakuza organizational history. Rather than depending on constant direct contact between every single member and centralized leadership, these prison-based groups developed regional leadership structures, essentially local franchise managers, empowered to enforce the organization's overall rules and maintain its overall reputation within whichever specific facility they happen to be housed in at any given moment, while still deferring to broader organizational leadership on matters of genuine, wider significance. This structure proved remarkably resilient against the routine disruption of prison life, transfers between facilities, extended stints in solitary confinement, sudden releases and reincarcerations, precisely because it didn't depend on any single individual remaining in one specific location to maintain organizational coherence. A member transferred to an entirely new facility, hundreds of miles from wherever he had previously been housed, could still be recognized, still be held accountable to the same rules, and still find protection and status within the same wider organization already operating at his new location. In much the same way a company transferring an employee between offices doesn't expect that employee to suddenly abandon every workplace norm and every professional relationship he had previously built. This portability turned out to be one of the single most important factors separating organizations that genuinely thrived across the entire American prison system from smaller, more localized groups that remained confined to a single facility or a single region, unable to offer members the same kind of consistent protection and status regardless of where the unpredictable machinery of the prison transfer system happened to send them next. It's also worth understanding how this portability shaped the broader competitive landscape between rival organizations operating within the same prison system. Because a membership model this flexible tended to produce winner-take-most dynamics within any given facility, once one organization had established a sufficiently large, sufficiently well-recognized presence. New arrivals, uncertain of their own safety and status within an unfamiliar facility, face strong incentive to align themselves with whichever organization already commanded the largest, most consistently enforced presence, rather than attempting to remain independent or aligning with a smaller, less established group offering weaker practical protection. This dynamic, once it took hold within a given regional prison system, tended to be remarkably self-reinforcing. A larger organization could offer more reliable protection, which attracted more members, which further increased its relative size and influence compared to smaller rivals, in a cycle that gradually concentrated organizational power within a relatively small number of dominant groups across most major prison systems examined throughout tonight's story. It's a pattern worth comparing to how network effects operate in many legitimate industries as well, where a platform or service that reaches sufficient scale tends to become increasingly difficult for smaller competitors to meaningfully challenge, not necessarily because the larger option is inherently superior in every respect, but simply because scale itself has become the primary source of its ongoing advantage. This portable structure ultimately shaped broader law enforcement strategy too, pushing agencies away from facility-specific interventions and toward considerably more coordinated, multi-jurisdictional approaches capable of tracking an organization's influence across an entire state or national prison system simultaneously, rather than treating each individual facility as an isolated problem to be solved independently. This shift in strategy, itself a direct response to exactly that portability, represents one of the more significant institutional adaptations in tonight's entire story. It's worth adding a final dimension to this portability story, because it also shaped how families and communities on the outside experienced the prison system's constant churn of transfers. A relative visiting an incarcerated family member often had no real say in which facility that person would eventually be held at, and organizations with genuinely national reach offered something the family itself sometimes came to rely on: informal reassurance that their incarcerated relative would find some baseline level of protection and structure regardless of which facility a transfer eventually sent him to. Precisely because the organization's presence extended everywhere the prison system's own transfer network happened to reach. This dynamic complicates any simple moral accounting of what these organizations actually provided their members, because alongside extortion, violence, and genuine harm, they also offered something resembling insurance against the genuine unpredictability and genuine danger of prison life more broadly, an unpredictability that formal prison administration, understaffed and overstretched across nearly every system examined tonight, has rarely managed to fully address on its own. It's a genuinely uncomfortable point to sit with, but an honest one. These organizations grew and persisted partly because they were solving a real problem, even while creating enormous problems of their own in the process. This portable franchise-style structure ultimately shaped the broader public's understanding of organized crime itself, moving popular perception away from the older image of crime as fundamentally local, tied to a specific neighborhood or a specific city, toward a considerably more accurate understanding of modern organized crime as genuinely national, even international, in its underlying reach and underlying structure. This shift in public perception, gradual as it was, mattered for policy purposes as well, helping build the political support necessary for the kind of coordinated, multi-jurisdictional law enforcement responses examined elsewhere tonight. responses that would have seemed considerably harder to justify politically if organized crime had continued to be understood, inaccurately, as a purely local, purely contained phenomenon confined to any single facility or any single city. Faced with organizations this adaptable, prison administrators eventually reached for one of the bluntest tools available: solitary confinement, or in the specific case of suspected organizational leadership, extended isolation units specifically designed to sever a prisoner's contact with the general population entirely, removing access to the exercise yard conversations, the shared meal hall interactions, and the informal note-passing networks that had sustained communication for so many decades across so many different organizations. This approach genuinely works, at least in the narrow, specific sense of disrupting the particular communication channels solitary confinement is designed to close. A prisoner held in near-total isolation cannot pass a kite during yard time, cannot coordinate quietly during a shared meal, cannot maintain the kind of ongoing personal relationships with other inmates that organizational leadership typically depends on to function effectively day to day. This particular solution comes with genuinely serious costs that extend well beyond the specific organizational leaders it was originally designed to target. Extended solitary confinement carries well-documented serious psychological consequences for anyone subjected to it, and the practice has been applied, in many documented cases, far more broadly than to the relatively small number of prisoners genuinely running significant criminal operations from behind bars. This has made solitary confinement one of the most persistently controversial tools in the entire modern prison system, defended by administrators as a genuinely necessary countermeasure against exactly the kind of organizational threat this whole episode has been describing, while criticized just as forcefully by human rights advocates and mental health professionals concerned about its broader, considerably less targeted application across the wider prison population. It's worth noting, too, that even this blunt, genuinely disruptive tool has never fully solved the underlying problem on its own. Organizations facing extended isolation of their leadership have generally adapted, much as any organization facing the sudden removal of its founder eventually adapts, shifting genuine operational authority toward whichever senior figures remain accessible enough to actually communicate, rather than collapsing entirely simply because one specific individual has been cut off from the broader network. It's worth considering, too, how isolation strategies have evolved beyond simple physical separation in more recent years, incorporating increasingly sophisticated monitoring technology alongside traditional solitary confinement. Some modern facilities now supplement physical isolation with detailed communication, logging even for the limited contact that remains permitted, tracking exactly which visitors an isolated prisoner receives, cross-referencing visitor identities against known associates of documented criminal organizations, and flagging patterns that might suggest coded communication, even when the actual content of a conversation appears, on its surface, to be entirely mundane. This more data-driven approach represents a genuine evolution beyond the blunter isolation strategies that dominated earlier decades, attempting to identify organizational activity through pattern recognition, rather than simply assuming that any contact whatsoever represents an unacceptable risk requiring complete severance. Whether this more targeted, more technologically sophisticated approach ultimately proves more effective than the cruder isolation policies it's gradually replacing remains, honestly, an open question that prison researchers are still actively studying, without any clear, settled conclusion having yet emerged from the available evidence. What does seem clear, based on the entire arc of tonight's story, is that whatever specific method authorities settle on next, the organizations on the other side of this contest have consistently shown themselves capable of eventually finding some new adaptation in response, a pattern that shows no genuine sign of ending anytime soon. It's worth a brief return to the human cost underlying this entire strategy, because it's easy, in a discussion this focused on tactics and countermeasures, to lose sight of what extended isolation actually means for the individual prisoners subjected to it, regardless of whether they genuinely represent the kind of organizational threat just described. That tension between a demonstrated institutional need and a genuinely serious human cost remains unresolved in nearly every prison system that has tried this particular approach, and it's likely to remain unresolved for a good while longer yet. It's worth adding one final dimension to the isolation story before closing out tonight's journey, because the debate over solitary confinement's effectiveness has increasingly intersected with a parallel debate over whether isolation actually achieves its stated organizational goal at all, separate from the question of its human cost. Some researchers studying organizational disruption have found that isolating known leadership sometimes accelerates a kind of leadership succession within the affected organization, with authority simply shifting to whichever senior figure remains reachable, rather than genuinely disrupting the organization's overall capability the way isolation's proponents originally intended. This finding complicates the simple narrative that isolation straightforwardly solves the problem it was designed to address. If an organization's underlying structure is genuinely distributed, the kind of franchise-style resilience examined throughout tonight's story, isolating any single figure, however senior, may accomplish considerably less than administrators initially hope, while still imposing the full, well-documented psychological cost on the individual prisoner involved. This tension between demonstrated organizational resilience and the genuine human cost of the countermeasures deployed against it remains, honestly, unresolved, and it's likely to remain a genuinely live question for prison policy researchers for a good while longer yet. It's worth a final reflection on what the isolation strategy's genuinely mixed track record suggests about the limits of purely institutional solutions to problems that are, at their core, deeply human in nature: loyalty, obligation, and the persistent human capacity to organize and communicate even under genuinely severe restriction. No architectural design, no matter how sophisticated, and no policy, no matter how well-intentioned, has yet managed to fully eliminate this underlying human capacity, and the entire history examined throughout tonight's journey suggests real reason for humility about whether any future measure, however technologically advanced, will manage to succeed where a century of prior attempts have each, in their own way, fallen at least somewhat short. By now, a genuine pattern should be clear across every single organization and every single country examined throughout tonight's story. Prison systems develop a new method of control. Criminal organizations, sometimes within months, sometimes within years, develop a workaround. Authorities respond with a further countermeasure, closing whatever specific gap had just been exploited. And somewhere, quietly, a new gap begins forming almost immediately, waiting to be discovered by whoever happens to notice it first. This isn't a story with a clean, permanent resolution, and it's worth being honest about that rather than pretending otherwise for the sake of a tidier ending. Modern prisons employ genuinely sophisticated monitoring technology their predecessors could never have imagined, from cell phone detection systems to closely analyzed visitor logs to increasingly restrictive isolation protocols reserved specifically for identified organizational leadership. And criminal organizations, facing each new restriction in turn, have consistently found some new adaptation, some new channel, some new low-tech or unexpectedly high-tech workaround nobody had specifically anticipated in advance. What's remained genuinely constant across every single example examined tonight, from Soviet labor camps to California prison yards to Italian maximum security wings to a mile-long tunnel dug directly beneath a cartel boss's cell, is simply this: physical containment and informational containment turn out to be two entirely different problems, solved through two entirely different sets of tools, and a prison system built primarily to solve the first one has spent the better part of a century, across nearly every country that has ever tried, discovering just how genuinely difficult the second one actually is. It's a strange kind of lesson to sit with as we close out tonight's story. You can lock a man's body inside a cell with absolute, total physical certainty. Locking his influence inside that same cell, it turns out, has never once been quite so simple. It's worth reflecting one last time on why this particular contest has proven so much harder to resolve permanently than most people, encountering this story for the first time, might initially expect. Nearly every other category of crime prevention benefits from a genuinely stable target. A bank vault, once designed and built, faces roughly the same threats year after year, allowing security to improve steadily over time without needing to constantly reinvent itself from scratch. Prison-based organizational communication offers no such stability. The moment one channel closes, the underlying motivation to find a replacement remains exactly as strong as it was before, and human ingenuity, given a genuinely strong enough incentive and genuinely enough time, has proven remarkably reliable at finding one. This is worth comparing, one final time, to how any sufficiently motivated adversary behaves across entirely unrelated fields: cybersecurity, financial fraud prevention, even something as mundane as spam filtering. Close one door and pressure simply redirects toward whichever door happens to still be open, and the underlying contest continues indefinitely, not because either side lacks genuine skill or genuine resources, but because the fundamental asymmetry never actually goes away. Defenders must close every single gap. Organizations only need to find one that remains open, and across the entire history examined tonight, from Soviet labor camps to a tunnel dug beneath a cell in Mexico, there has, sooner or later, always been one. And perhaps that's the quietest, most honest note to end on tonight. Not a dramatic final victory for either side, because there genuinely hasn't been one in any of the countries or any of the decades we've traveled through this evening. Just a long, patient, ongoing contest between two forms of ingenuity, one built to contain, one built to persist, each shaping the other slowly, one small adaptation at a time, across 100 years and counting. One final thought is worth carrying with you as you drift off, because it reframes everything examined tonight into a single, unified observation. Every single organization profiled tonight, whether built around tattoos and Soviet camp tradition, blood oaths and absolute loyalty, or a mile of hand-dug tunnel beneath a cartel boss's cell, was ultimately solving the exact same basic problem in its own particular way. How do you maintain genuine influence over a world you can no longer physically touch? The specific answers varied enormously by country, by era, and by the particular resources available to whichever organization happened to be attempting it. The underlying question, remarkably, never really changed at all. If you're still awake, that's all right. There's no need to follow the rest. Just let the sound carry you the rest of the way.